Who decided what Christians should believe? There was a point in history, an event hundreds of years after Jesus' death, that changed what Christians believe and hold to be true even today. Yes, you heard it right, the religion changed. A lot of people are blissfully unaware of the fact that just how many dynamic transformation the religion we call Christianity went through. And honestly, this was true for me as well. I remember the Sunday schools I attended, the Bible classes in the Protestant middle school I went to, and the church service every Sunday. They all seem to present the same image. Christianity as a solid, eternal, unchanging religion, ones whose doctrines, claims and beliefs had always been the same. Or at least, that is how I understood it as a child. But I think many Christians still today carry this image with them. They imagine Christian doctrine as something that simply existed from the beginning, fully formed, as if it had been just dropped straight out from the Bible. That is why I want to start a series looking at historical events that shaped and reshaped Christian doctrine and belief. Because I think it's fascinating that how much religion changed and how differently Christians actually believed from one century to another. It was truly an evolution. I remember the Heidelberg Catechism, a small book that I had to memorize as a child for my confirmation, the traditional initiation ceremony for the Calvinistic Reformed Church in Hungary. In it, there were creeds and questions about the Trinity, about the nature of God, about what a Christian is supposed to believe. And as a child, I naively assumed that these beliefs had always been the same. I thought they must have come from directly and unequivocally from the Bible. Like, the doctrine of the Trinity is familiar to most of you all. One God in three persons, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Each person is fully and equally God, sharing the same divine essence. Yet the three are not three gods, but one God. But where did this idea come from? How did Christians arrive at this formulation? And who decided that this and not something else would become Orthodox Christianity? In this video, I want to explore the origins of this doctrine and take you to the Council of Nicaea. I want to look at what Christians believed before and after the formation of the Nicene Creed. A creed that became foundational for the doctrine of the Trinity and to later Christian orthodoxy. In other words, I want to understand who decided what I was supposed to believe as a child and why. To understand what happened in May of 325 AD at Nicaea, in what is now modern-day Turkey, we first need to ask a simple question. What was the controversy that had become so serious that the Roman Emperor Constantine himself called meetings of the bishops from across the empire? Why would an emperor care so much about a theological dispute? To answer that, we need to take a look first at the state of Christianity in the early centuries, and also the history of Constantine himself. Believe it or not, the first few hundred years of Christianity were not nearly as smooth and unified as they would present it for me in Sunday school. Actually, it was chaotic. After the death of Christ, the religion spread across the Roman Empire and beyond. It encountered different people, different customs, different prior religions, different philosophies, different ways of understanding God, salvation, and the figure of Jesus. And this was not a religion spreading through a printing press, or a standardized catechism, or through a central doctrinal authority that could instantly correct everyone. It spread word of mouth, from person to person, from city to city, from one community to another. So you can imagine there were some wild variations. I already covered one of them in my previous video about the Gospel of Judas. And some scholars like Bart Ehrman go as far as arguing that we shouldn't even speak of an early single Christianity, but we should rather speak about multiple Christianities. For example, there was the Jewish Christian community around James, Jesus' brother, probably one of the groups that was closer to what Jesus was standing for. There were also other Jewish Christian groups, like the Ebionites, who believed Jesus was fully human and became God's adopted son. Then there were Marcionites, who just saw Jesus as a purely divine figure, who stood against the Jewish creator God. And there were various Gnostic groups who connected salvation to secret knowledge. These are only examples, not an exhaustive list, but they show a bigger point. Early Christianity was not one simple unified religion. There were competing Christianities. Finally, I want to mention the Proto-Orthodox movement. They were not the majority at first, but by the beginning of the 4th century, they have become strong and influential. These are the people I want to talk about in this video. They are the ones who later became Orthodoxy. They used their influence to push out other Christians and then acted as if they were always been the majority and always been the truth. But even amongst their own ranks, there were divisions, controversies that would become a major topic at the Council of Nicaea. So, now we have laid the groundwork for understanding just how chaotic Christianity actually was in the early centuries. But to understand what really went down at Nicaea, we need to take a look at Constantine's history and motivation next. In the early 3rd and 4th centuries, there was chaos not only amongst Christians, but in the Roman Empire as well. Instability, economic crisis, infighting. The Emperor Diocletian had just stepped down, and the Tetrarchy was falling apart. The empire had been formally divided between 4 rulers. But no, the whole system was cracking. The ruler of Britain and Gaul, Constantius Colorius maybe, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. He was Constantine's father. He died just 1 year after Diocletian's resignation. So, no, there was a huge power vacuum in the empire, and this is where Constantine's story really begins. This is where he shows his real ambition. First, he consolidates power and deals with his rivals in his late father's domain. Then, he turns towards Rome, which is now under the rule of Maxentius. He marches with his army towards the city, and this is where his Christian mythos begins. According to the story, Constantine sees a vision from God, and then he orders his soldiers to paint a Christian sign on their shield. It probably was a cross or another sign, it's not sure, there are multiple versions of the story. But with this, he defeats Maxentius at Milvian Bridge in Rome 312 AD. And according to the myth, this is the moment that pushes Constantine towards Christian conversion. The vision came true, and the Christian God had gave him victory. But this is where this story becomes politically important for us. The next year, in 313 AD, Constantine issues the Edict of Milan, together with Licinius, the man who had in the same time consolidated power in the other half of the Roman Empire. And this changed everything. Christianity was no longer a persecuted religion, trying to survive on the margins of Roman society. It now had legal freedom. Christian communities could own property. Bishops became public figures. But there was a problem. With increasing popularity, bishops started to gain political influence, which eventually led to infighting amongst Christians over power and legitimacy. One example of this was the Donatist division in North Africa. But there is a deeper crisis was growing and brewing in the eastern half of the empire, where Licinius ruled. In 324 AD, Constantine defeats Licinius too, and now, for the first time, Constantine ruled the entire Roman Empire alone. But with the whole empire in his hands, he also inherited the church's internal conflicts. This is the moment that he realizes just how bad the division was. It was no longer just a church issue. It was becoming a problem for the empire. So, 1 year after defeating Licinius, he calls on the bishops to meet in Nicaea, 325 AD. This is what became known as the Council of Nicaea. Okay, now we have a good historical context. Next, we need to look at what was this big controversy. What started it all? It's called the Arian Controversy. It started in Alexandria around 318 AD. It began when Alexander, the bishop of Alexandria, accused one of his presbyters, Arius, of heresy. And this was not just a small personal conflict, it was a deep theological dispute about who Jesus really was. Arius had what we call a lower Christology. He believed that Jesus was a created being, the first and the most perfect creation of God, but not equal with the Father. Alexander, on the other hand, defended a higher Christology. He emphasized the divinity of Christ and the oneness with God. And because of this, he accused Arius of turning Christianity into something dangerously close to polytheism. But the controversy became even more serious because Arius was not alone. He gained support from important bishops, including Eusebius of Nicomedia and Eusebius of Caesarea. So, this is how the controversy started. But why was this dispute so important for Constantine? We can understand his motivations from one of the letters he sent to the two disagreeing parties, Alexander and Arius. Constantine had just conquered the eastern part of the empire. He was on his way to Palestine, but while traveling he received news about the controversy in the Eastern Church, and he immediately turned back to Nicomedia to send out this letter. And from the tone of the letter, we can see that he was not happy. He immediately realizes just how serious of an implications this whole situation could have on his newly united empire. At first he tries to downplay the whole situation. He presents it as a minor theological nitpicking, a dispute about things that have no real bearing on Christianity and that concerns only matters that only God would actually truly know. In other words, he's basically saying, why are you dividing the church over something like this? He thinks the issue can be solved easily. Call together the bishops of the empire and settle the matter at once and for all, and create unity. But then, the letter turns into something much bigger. It becomes almost a political and religious rant. Constantine talks about how God lifted him up, helped him defeat his enemies, and allowed him to unite the empire. For Constantine, God's will and imperial unity are connected. One empire under one God, one emperor. Two sides of the same coin. A bit ambitious. And this is why the controversy mattered to him so much. It was not just a theological argument, it was a threat to the unity of the empire he just conquered. And so Constantine called the Council of Nicaea. Okay, now we understand the basic motivations of Constantine. But Constantine was not the only player at Nicaea. So next, we need to take a look at the other people involved, the bishops and the different factions forming around them. First, there was Arius. We already talked about his theological positions. For him, the goal was most likely about holding on to his beliefs and also securing legitimacy inside the church. Because if Arius was declared wrong, he was not just losing an argument, he was losing his standing, his authority, and possibly his entire place within the Christian community. The most important figure here was Alexander, the Bishop of Alexandria, and next to him was his deacon Athanasius, who would later become Bishop of Alexandria himself also, and one of the most important defenders of Nicene Christianity. Around Alexander and Athanasius, other bishops also gathered. So even early in the controversy, this group already had serious church influence and political weight. But we should be careful here. It is tempting to imagine the anti-Arians as one united theological bloc, but in reality, they were not all saying exactly the same thing. They did not necessarily have one perfect united doctrine yet. What united them was something more immediate, opposition to Arius. They were one of the strongest political blocs in the conflict. But there is one more thing that is very important to understand. And this was probably true not only for the anti-Arians, but for most of the people involved in the council. They came from a world still deeply shaped by pagan culture. One thing is clear. They were steeped in traditions, philosophy, and a worldview of the Roman Empire. And that empire was not intellectually neutral. It was full of different philosophical traditions, religious assumptions, and ways of understanding and thinking about God, reality, hierarchy, and the cosmos. This matters because these Christians did not interpret Jesus in a vacuum. They used the intellectual tools they already had. They used the categories, assumptions, and worldviews they inherited from the pagan world. They interpreted and in some ways reimagined the life and teachings of Jesus. For example, the anti-Arian side was influenced by Platonism. They interpreted Christian teachings through Platonic categories of being and reality. And because of this, they emphasized the unity of the Father and the Son, so much more than Arius did. Let's quickly wrap up with the other factions. There were bishops somewhere in the middle, like Eusebius of Caesarea. Then there were defenders of Arius, like Eusebius of Nicomedia, who also had their own unique theological ideas. And of course there were a large group of less confrontational bishops, people who were not necessarily leading the debate, but were trying to read the room. They saw where the emperor stood. They saw where the power was moving. And many of them most likely sided with Constantine, in hoping to end up on the winner's side and keep their status inside the church. This was a long setup with a lot of information. I hope you are still here. We finally arrived to discuss what went down at the council and how this affected Christian belief. The council started in May of 325 AD in Nicaea, and it began with a speech from Constantine. In that speech, he laid out the same grand vision we already saw in his letter. Unity, peace, one church, one empire under one God. And he made it clear that a council could not simply end without an agreement. There had to be a conclusion. Constantine even attended some of the meetings himself, probably to make sure the bishops did not get completely deadlocked. But even with the emperor pushing for unity, it still took months to reach a final decision. And in that final decision, Constantine played a very important role. He did not just sit there as a neutral observer. He helped to steer the discussion. And the center of that final formula was one word: homoousios. This word became the turning point of the council. It basically means that the Father and the Son shares the same essence, the same divine substance. And this became one of the most important theological definitions in Christian history. But this is where the things get really interesting. Scholars debate exactly where this word came from and why Constantine accepted it. But there is an agreement that homoousios was not biblical language. It was not a word that the apostles used. It came from a wider pagan Hellenistic philosophical world of the Roman Empire. According to Nordeval, a scholar, the word may have been suggested to Constantine by one of the anti-Arian bishops. And this is important because the term already had some controversial associations. It had been connected with Gnostic ideas, and it is also carried the dangers of sounding Sabellian, as if the Father and the Son were not truly distinct, but just different modes of the same God. So, for many bishops, this was not an obvious or comfortable word. But another scholar, Pier Franco Beatrice, argues something different. He suggests that the word may have come from Constantine's own intellectual background, from his earlier education before Christian conversion. And this is the part that I find both shocking and fascinating. The Nous Father and the Logos Son are two distinct divine realities, but they share the same perfect divine nature. To a Christian, that sounds immediately familiar, because this is the relationship between the Father and the Son. To most Christians, this sounds completely normal. This sounds like Orthodox Christianity. This sounds like the Trinity. But here is the twist. This exact philosophical language is not from the Bible. And according to Beatrice, this formulation I just gave you is Egyptian pagan Hermetic theology, the intellectual world behind the Corpus Hermeticum. In other words, one of the most important theological formulations in Christian history. The language used to define the relationship between the Father and the Son, or maybe the entire relationship, may have been shaped by pagan philosophical or mystical traditions, whether Hermetic, Gnostic, or both. This is utterly fascinating, and I have to be honest, for the Christian child still somewhere inside me, this is deeply unsettling. And Arius clearly found it concerning too. For him, this formulation was unacceptable. So in the end, he refused to sign the creed. And what is interesting, that this formulation did not perfectly align with the views of the anti-Arian side either. They did not fully agree with it. But with this formula, backed by the emperor himself, the anti-Arians secured the most important thing they wanted: the rejection of Arius. So they signed it. And this is where Constantine's character becomes clear. He was not a neutral referee. He was the emperor who just conquered his rivals and reunited the Roman Empire. And now he wanted the church to be united also. He may have been flexible on theological details, but he was not flexible about unity. He wanted a settlement and an agreement, a visible end to the conflict. Because religious division was becoming a political problem for his dream. One empire, one God, one emperor. And so when Arius and the other two bishops who refused to sign were exiled from the empire. It is important to remember one thing. The Nicene Creed was not yet the final and fully developed doctrine of the Trinity. That came later. But Nicaea was foundational. It clarified the relationship between the Father and the Son. And you may have noticed that we didn't talk about the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit. That is because the original Nicene Creed did not say much about it. It basically just said, we believe in the Holy Spirit. No explanation, no developed doctrine, no detailed relationship between the Spirit, the Father, and the Son. That came decades later, at another council, where the Holy Spirit was upgraded into the same divine framework as the Father and the Son. So yeah, basically, that is the story how imperial politics, church power, and philosophical language from the wider pagan world helped shape what Christians came to believe. And what I, centuries later, had to memorize as a child. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe. Bye.